This is Book TV's Afterwards podcast. This week, New York Times op-ed columnist Charles Blow makes his case for black people to amass political power to combat white supremacy in his book, The Devil You Know, a Black Power Manifesto. He's interviewed by author and Woodson Center founder and president, Robert Woodson.
I was pleasantly surprised when I picked up your book, The Devil You Know. I expected to have much to disagree with, but I find a lot of common ground, and I hope that's not to your disadvantage. But I'd like to start, it's a fascinating book. I'd like to ask you about the title.
Yes.
Tell us something about the title before we get into the content.
But there was a line in the book proposal that said that, you know, when Black people took part in the Great Migration, they left the devil they knew for the devil they didn't, only to come to realize that the devil is the devil, that racism was everywhere. And so the devil you know, in this context, is the racism itself, ubiquitous in America.
Well, that's interesting. So let's get right into a deep dive into the book. What I find refreshing about it is that you see a lot of public policy autopsy books who just talk about the problem, whine about it, but you will have a specific proposal. Tell us what that proposal is in terms of the recolonization, if you may.
Yes. So at the end of the Civil War, 3 Southern states were majority Black. 3 others were within 4 percentage points of being majority Black. If Black people had not migrated, and I understand why they did, but if they had not migrated, it is possible that Black people could control up to 14 Senate seats or be the majority part of the coalition to do that. It is possible that they could have control more electoral college votes than California and New York State combined. It is possible that they would have real power on a state level. And so what I am saying to Black America, particularly young Black Americans, I saw you in the streets. I have seen you protesting about this. I've heard your wails. If you really want a shot at changing the systems that you are protesting against, one of the quickest, most powerful ways to do that is through state power. I'm asking that they consider a reverse migration, which a lot of people are already doing without thinking about political considerations. But I'm saying do it with political intentionality.
Those of my generation remember something in 1967, the Republic of New Africa. And
Absolutely.
I know you have referenced it in your book. Perhaps you should share with us what is similar to what was proposed back then, and how does your proposal differ?
Yes. So soon after the riots in the late 1960s, a group of radicals, I guess they called them, revolutionaries we might call them, met and they formed a provisional government of the Republic of New Africa. And what they were saying is pretty much this idea, which is return south, but their list of demands was broader. They wanted to establish a separate republic in the southern states and to demand reparations from America to basically help to finance that republic. My proposal differs in that I am not actually seeking secession. I don't want a separate republic. I want to be stronger within this republic.
But one would have to ask, part of my generation was, we said to America, passage of the civil rights legislation, give us the political power, put us in charge of the cities, the courts, healthcare systems, and we will be better for our people than the people we're replacing. We've had 50 years of Black political rule in the cities, why do we have some of the disparities that we're talking about?
Because there are no cities in the Constitution. The Supreme Court has basically said, in ruling after ruling, not in implicit ways, not explicit ones necessarily, that cities exist at the leisure of the states. That's why you have preemption by states. There's nothing that a city can do that the state government can't come in and preempt. We see that in the pandemic. We have all these liberal cities that want to have to crack down on the pandemic in harder ways, and the Republican government says, no, you can't do that, and they can't. There's nothing they can do. So it is great to have municipal control. There are 1,200 majority Black cities in America. 90% of them are in the South. It's actually a good feeling to live in that kind of an environment. However, I understand that this is the United States of America, not the Federation of Cities of America. And that means that if you want real power, the half of the power that the Constitution gives not to the federal government, you have to be in charge of states. You have to have power in the state, on the state level. And so when people look at cities that have struggled, because it just so happens that those are also majority Black cities, that ignores the whole idea that there was massive white flight and massive white disinvestment. And they fled at the time that they still had all the money and still had all the resources. So now the city has an incredible infrastructure and not enough tax base to support it. They look over the fact that these cities can't do any more than the states will allow them to do. The cities still depend on those states for resources, but they don't control those states. It is almost a shame to listen to people blame the cities for not doing better when in fact it was the pattern and behavior of white people when Black people moved to those cities that hurt those cities in the first place.
I see. But in your book, you also are critical of my generation of leadership, as I have been. Part of the reasons why I left the civil rights movement in the 60s is because many of the people who suffered and sacrificed most did not benefit from the change.
Yes.
When the doors of opportunity were open, it benefited those who were well-educated, but leaving behind the poor. And I think you make some of that same argument. Would you explain your response to the elite? Sure.
You know, I would say this, no matter the color, no matter the community, the aristocracy is always looking out for the aristocracy. This whole idea of, talented 10th is going to raise all boats. That's kind of a trickle-down equality that doesn't work any more than trickle-down economics works. The aristocracy will always be foremost invested in maintaining itself. And so you see that happen over and over and over again. What I'm saying here is this movement doesn't depend on the aristocracy. This is literally a family by family decision. This is a person by person decision where the change will come from the bottom up.
When you say the change will come from the bottom up, which is a very different approach, because particularly you mentioned that many white liberals believe that their presence alone is enough of a catalyst to stimulate change. And you are critical of some of the people who say they are our friends. Would you speak to that?
Yes. Well, I'll say a couple of things. Number one, just because you are liberal on some issues does not mean that you are a racial egalitarian. Just because you believe in fighting climate change and you believe in a woman's right to choose, and you may believe in gay marriage, does not mean that you think that all people, regardless of color, are equal. And we find that out over and over and over in very painful ways. So that is part of the problem. So I lived in New York City at the height of stop and frisk, which was a incredibly racist, skewed system where 90% of the people who were stopped and frisked were innocent. Most of those people were Black and brown boys, some young men, but many of them boys. And whenever Quinnipiac would ask the white citizens, they would ask everybody, but they broke out by race, whether or not they agreed with this policy. Every single time, the majority of white people said they agree with it. This is New York, one of the places we consider to be one of the most liberal places in America.
In your, you said here that the elite class, either Black or nor white, liberate or otherwise, we will never offer a path to restitution or restoration for the Black masses. Black healing and rebuilding must come from the bottom up and not the top down.
Yes.
Would you elaborate more on that? Because a lot of people believe that it is the elites who deliver us. I think Dr. King said it about in his letter from a Birmingham jail that sometimes it's some of the people who are supposed to be our liberators are not our friends.
Yes.
You know, the biggest stumbling block is not the White Citizens Council or the KKK, but the white moderate. That lukewarm acceptance from people of goodwill is more difficult to accept an outright rejection of people of ill will. Yes. You seem to be making that same point that King did.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that you're asking a question that incorporates two groups of people. One is Black aristocracy and the other is the white moderate. You know, in any group, if you have a government, particularly a democratic government, you're going to have leaders, right? So there's always going to be a hierarchy there, but you're going to vote, you're going to elect somebody, they're going to run the government while you run your life and feed your family. That said, there are a lot of people who are now conditioned to having their power be generated from their proximity to whiteness and white power. And that group of people is invested in you not leaving, you not migrating, to you not finding a better future somewhere else, because they are the Negro whisperer who they send to the ghetto or whatever they call the ghetto to say, tell them to go vote for this Congress, this councilman, and tell them to go vote for this mayor. You know them very well. And don't you know so-and-so on that block? And don't you know the barbershop? And that is how they derive their power. There will always be opposition from that class of people to the people on the bottom, the working class people doing for themselves what they have been knighted to do. The other issue you bring up there is the white liberal. Those are the people, the white moderate, right? Those are the people who say, I agree with you in general, but now is not the right time. We have bigger fish to fry. There will always be a bigger fish to fry than tackling white supremacy and searching for Black equality. Always, always. You know, the reason that Reconstruction failed is because there was a contested election, and the compromise, it's always a compromise that leaves us in the cold. The compromise was to withdraw federal troops from the South, and that would let the liberals have the presidency. Well, everybody knew what was going to happen. And that's exactly what happened. Terror reigned, and you got everybody calling state after state after state in the South, call a constitutional convention to literally write white supremacy into the DNA of those states. And in fact, you know, I went back and read those minutes. They're not shy about it. This is not some artful language. They're literally saying, I'm here to write white supremacy into the law.
And you also talk about the role of partisan politics. You acknowledge that President Trump, as despised as he has been he attracted the largest percentage of Black votes in the last 40 years, and a significant number of Hispanic votes, I think by 30%.
Yes.
And gays as well.
Yes.
And so it seems to me that people made strategic decisions, and maybe not racial ones. Do you see it that way? Or what do you see the role of partisan politics? We are so wedded to a political party Is that helpful to what you're proposing?
Well, I make very clear in the book that when I say Black power, it doesn't necessarily mean party power. So it doesn't mean Democratic Party power or any other party power. It does mean that I believe in Black self-determination. My own politics are liberal, right? I believe that with more prosperity for Black people, you'll get more liberalism among Black people. But because there's so much oppression in the Black community, you have to lean on something bigger than yourself. We have, that's part of the reason we have a higher levels of religiosity, I believe. It's because I had to believe in something. This thing is crushing me. I see no path for me or my family out of it. I have to hand this over to somebody, right? So that makes sense to me. Generally speaking, though, right now, Blacks are on social issues, very conservative. The reason that Black people cannot support the Republican Party is that they have openly courted and abided the racists. So it's just a no from the beginning. You can't even have the conversation because it's a no. That is, I think, slightly different than what we saw in the election results. In the first election, almost a third of Hispanics and Asians voted for Donald Trump. That was after he said the Mexicans were rapists and killers, after the Muslim ban, after all that he had done. He amped that up. He separated the kids from their parents, and the list goes on and on and on. And his biggest increases were in these immigrant communities. That says to me a number of things. Number one, not all minorities in this country are going to be allied on the racial question. It also reveals something that we don't talk a lot about, which is that anti-Blackness is a global phenomenon. A lot of people who immigrate to America bring that anti-Blackness from the place they come from. There is a reason that in Brazil, I think they asked people to, put their race. They came up with 134 different variations of Black. Because as Skip Gay says, nobody wanted to be Black. Anti-Blackness is, unfortunately, pervasive. It exists in some parts of the Caribbean, it exists in some parts of South America, it exists in some parts of Asia, it exists in Europe, everywhere. So the idea that the browning of America will somehow be the savior for Black people is not necessarily a well-grounded philosophy in which one should put their hopes.
To make your point, Pele, who was Brazil's and the world's famous soccer player, Brazil, had to be an official white person in order to get a passport to travel.
Mm-hmm.
That's your point.
Mm-hmm.
But you also in the book talk about the role of rage. That's everybody seems to galvanize in protest, and you discuss rage. So explain how you characterize the importance, or is it a distraction?
I don't think it's a distraction. I think it is a natural response to this sort of oppression. It's that it has a limited utility when it comes to the acquisition and maintenance of political power. Rage can change the conversation. It can change the narrative. It can direct attention. But as in the same way that the attention can get directed, it can get redirected in the next week or the next month. If you want to have real change in policy, a real shift in power that is rooted in policy, that is rooted in legislation, that is rooted in constitutions, both state and federal, that is where you must make the change for lasting conversion of policy.
But in your book, you talk a lot in terms of figures in the past. And the question for you is, are there lessons from the past that can be helpful in our presence and what we achieved in the face of oppression and Jim Crow? In my era, for instance, I grew up in a blue-collar neighborhood, and I differ a little in some of your assessment because in my experience in Philadelphia, low-income Blacks and middle class did not live together. We were separate. There were different enclaves. There were no professionals, no doctors, no lawyers living in our blue-collar neighborhood. They lived in Germantown or Yeadon and other places. And so there's this notion that somehow with desegregation, that the middle class moved out, leaving behind only the poor. And I was wondering if you could, what has been your experience as you look at
one of the fascinating interviews I had for the book was with Timisul Black, who is in Chicago, I think 101 now. And he was part of the first wave of the Great Migration when he was very young. And he reflects on this idea as well that, that desegregation of housing in Chicago happened so quickly that it was detrimental, that if it were slower, maybe it would have been a little bit better. But he describes a phenomenon where in the very beginning, Black people had no choice but to be together. So the professionals were with the rest of the Black community, and that everyone benefited from that idea. That the Blacks who were better off had an incentive to help other people to be better off because they were their neighbors. You couldn't have a better community unless you made life better for everybody else. And people who were not as well off benefited from seeing up close and personal these models of behavior and success. And that when Black people were allowed to fan out, they did so as quickly as they could. And the people who were kind of left without options were also left in a more concentrated state of poverty. That exists in a lot of cities, particularly in the cities that people migrated to. There were communities that were basically roped off as Black. That's where you were supposed to be. And because that became the legacy of the community, they have never truly been fully serviced and restored. And people think about success as not as building that area up, but moving out of that area.
Do you see any tension between the emphasis on race and economic development?
I've always thought the two are tied in America. And in fact, the white upper class historically has used the white lower class as its weapon to maintain itself. Like the agitation or allowing or promoting even agitation with other poor people and creating that division was helpful to them. So I don't see how race and class are separate things. People always want to say, that one is the bigger issue than the other. I think they're cousins linked at the hip.
Well, again, in my generation, I remember, as I said, leading demonstrations outside of a pharmaceutical company in Baird Rustin's town of Westchester for 3 months. And when they desegregated, they'd hired 9 Black PhD chemists. And we asked them to join our movement. They said they got these because they were qualified and not because of the struggles. That happened several times. And that's when I came to the realization that many of the people who have suffered most did not benefit from the change, and that a lot of times the demographics of those who are struggling are used to promote remedies that don't help them. And I was wondering if you experienced that in your research and looking at why communities and your strategies are rebuilding communities.
I'm not sure I understand that question.
I mean that when sometimes you were talking about the elites, both
Yes.
Black and white, I think sometimes believe that even elite Blacks propose remedies that benefit them, but not necessarily low-income Blacks.
Yes. Well, listen, I will say this. You will always, because these are human beings, regardless of race, you'll always have that strain. You're always going to have have to deal with the issue of income distribution and income inequality. You're always going to have to deal with the rub between the working class and the elite class. What I'm saying, though, is you don't always have to deal with white supremacy being an extra layer on top of all of that. I am not proposing a utopian society that solves all your problems. I am proposing a society where white supremacy is not the prevailing ethos, where I can have the same set of problems that the white people have with income inequality, and I can try to work those out without having to worry about whether or not it feels like the police are stalking my children, without have to worry about mass incarceration in disproportionately affecting Black people, without having to worry about health policies that disproportionately affect Black people. I want to have the regular worries that white people have about income inequality that are divorced from white supremacy.
So in your book, you also, in looking back, talk about Booker T. Washington. And back in my day, of course, my generation, and I think many of us betrayed your generation. I think we spent so much time trying to give you the things that we didn't have. We didn't give you the things that we did have. And what we did have back then is aggressive debate within our community as to the way forward.
Yes.
There was King, there was Malcolm X, there was a Panthers, there was a Republic of New Africa, SNCC. There was just tension, but the tension was always around agency.
Yes.
What we were going to do to promote our advancement. And it seems to me that you are suggesting the same thing in your book, that these are the kinds of issues that you're stirring the pot with it. And you mentioned Booker T. Washington and the Rosenwald schools.
Yes.
And your reverence for him. Not many people who propose what you do have a reverence for him. Right. And I was wondering if you'd talk about that.
Absolutely. One thing that I want to make very clear is throughout American history, Black people have struggled with how best to help the Black race. Our leaders have struggled with this. And there have been people who absolutely loved Black people, wanted the best for Black people, who made horrible miscalculations. I don't believe for a second that Booker T. Washington didn't love Black people with every fiber of his body and wanted the best for them. He just made a horrible miscalculation. And I think we keep making it, which is that we think that white supremacy can be negotiated with. We think that if we just do better, they will see us as whole. They will see us as equal. They will see us as deserving, that we can earn our way into equality rather than being born into equality. His horrible miscalculation was that he believed that you could earn your way into it, and he was willing to take a second seat while we got ourselves together and tried to earn our way into it. Now listen, Booker T. Washington existed. He was born into slavery, existed during Reconstruction, right after the slaves were freed. It is estimated that a quarter of all Black people in America, right after the end of slavery, got sick or died, seriously sick or died. People, he was describing in his book, people would come to school, they had never used a toothbrush, they never slept in a bed, they had only slept on the floor. People were starving and sick. His own mother died during this period. There's a part of me that says, I don't even know what it looks. It's easy for me to look back and say, okay, he made this horrible miscalculation that I can't have nothing to do with him. It's a whole other thing to have been born like that and live like that the first years of your life, and to live through a catastrophe for Black people where they're literally starving and sick, and whatever little medical infrastructure that did exist collapsed around them. And so he makes a calculation to say, let's just get us jobs so that we can sustain ourselves and eat and get on our feet. But to do that, you gave up the only power that we had, which was we had incredible numbers in the South. So I am disappointed in the eventual repercussions of what he did. But I fully know that I am looking back retrospectively from a very comfortable seat here in Atlanta talking to you.
Yeah. But what when you say that, what do you think he should have done? I know what he did do, of course, in cooperation with Julius Rosenwald, build 5,000 Rosenwald schools throughout the South.
Listen, that's the whole point. There are things that Washington did that were incredibly helpful. The one that he did that was harmful was he basically gave white people permission, moral permission, to say that you are a second-class citizen not deserving of full participation in the civic activities of your government. He gave that permission. But on the ground, of course, this man is working his whole life to try to better the conditions of Black people.
Yeah. Yeah, and in the whole issue, you have a strong statement about self-determination. Even back in then, self-determination, that with those 5,000 Rosenwald schools, the education gap between Blacks and whites in the South between 1920 and 1940 closed from 8th grade, I think 3 years, down to 2.5 and 20 years. That because of the Rosenwald schools. It seems to me that was an incredible accomplishment under conditions of segregation. The question is, why are we not able to accomplish some of that in the presence of the kind of control we do have over our systems today?
You know, well, first let's start by the Rosenwald schools. Some of these kids were going to school in buildings with dirt floors if they were going to school at all. Okay. I mean, it's part of it was just basic shelter. And part of the buildings with the Rosenwald schools was also shelter for teachers. These teachers weren't making any money. And this was a way for them. So that was happening. But that was moving from a state of absolute destitution to some normalcy and just basic humanity for these children. The step now is, how is it that we were ever in this position of being looked upon as inferior in the first place, as other equal human beings? And why is it taking 400 years and we still not to the position of erasing this thing that should never have been done in the first place? And why is it that I should have to pat you on the back for whatever you call progress, for undoing something that should never have been done, and you still haven't finished undoing it?
Yeah.
To me, that is the problem.
I see. You have a quote that I found intriguing. I'd like you to talk about. I think it's on page 117. It is active in the whole issue of activism and going back to how do we promote change? How do we build on the Rosenwald, the energy, the whatnot? And you said here, the activism becomes an exercise in credentialing, a way of positioning in pursuit of power. And then you say, turning Black struggle into an anthology, and Black pain into pedagogy. Just what did you mean by that? I found that an intriguing.
Well, it means that, there's a class of people within the Black elite who are basically making an industry out of explaining Black pain to white people.
Oh.
And maybe it shifts something, but that is not, to me, it seems the aim of it. The aim of it is to get in the good graces of the white academy, to be part of the canon, to gain your laurels as the whisperer of the Black people. And I guess there's some art to that, and there's definitely some fortune involved in that. But to me, that has never been truly about getting equality for Black people. That is about mining the market of white guilt.
Isn't that destructive to the ends of Black self-determination?
To me, it is.
If people are profiting off of peddling pathology or saying to people repeatedly that you can't make it, these are the barriers, or what have you?
Maybe it's, that's part of it, but part of it is just the constant strain to make poetry of the pain. Like, the reason I never wanted to write a race book is that I don't want to do this. I don't want to find a more artful way to say this is really problematic. Wow. I don't want to find a more artful way to say it hurts to see another Black man gunned down in the street. I don't want the white guilt industry to say, oh my God, did you read the way he described it? I want a solution. I have 3 children in this world, all young adults. The idea that I could leave this life and they are fighting the same battle that I'm fighting is a problem for me. I want a solution.
Well, I applaud you, because how is your views being received by some of your colleagues who are oriented towards race? Some people get up every day and talking about race, and white guilt is that's their forte. They know how to mine white guilt.
We'll see once they read the book.
But I applaud that, because that's as a conservative oriented, I too believe that we must be seeking common ground on solutions, that we don't have time to blame. And the message that is going to our young people is defeat. Defeatism clothed in militant opposition to whites. And so I'm just delighted to read in your book that you didn't want to be a race man, but solutions. Why do you think it's so difficult to even get a discussion around solutions? Why are there so few people even mentioning the word solutions?
Well, I think that people are hard pressed to find them. There's solutions there are smaller solutions to provincial problems. So there are solutions on a local level: ban chokeholds to keep people from being choked to death on the street. Institute laws that make officers intervene if they feel like their fellow officers going too far. Those are provincial solutions. Grand solutions are harder for people to come by. And that's what I was in search of. I need a grand solution where we can start to address all of this, because if we just peck around the edges, we'll be pecking until the chickens die.
Well, my hope is that your book will excite a kind of discussion of solutions, because it is really needed, particularly around the issue of the role of race and the role of rage.
Thank you.
Because people are using it as a substitute for solutions and substance.
Thank you.
And there are people, our people are desperate for the kind of thinking that you have laid out in your book. But when you do discuss these ideas in the academy, what has been your response when you
well, I haven't yet had a chance to discuss in the academy. You know,
I'm sure this isn't the first time, though.
The book is due.
I'm sure it's not the first time that you've espoused these things.
Oh, in this context, yes, it is actually. I mean, it's you'll appreciate this. The publisher was very interested in me not saying anything about this until the book came out. So,
is that right?
Yes.
But I think it's really offering a unique perspective, because there really is a mixed message going out, and that race is the only thing we need to be paying attention to, and talking about a regional. Are you concerned that if this migration took place, that only a certain class of people would be able to move, and what would it do for the people left behind? Or
I think that's something you should consider. However, I would also look at one of the best examples of this ever working was in Vermont. Early 1970s, two young law students at Yale wrote a paper in the Yale Law Review, I think it was called Jamestown 70, where they argued, all this Vietnam protesting, all this radicalism, you're not going to have a revolution the way you think you are. What you can do is what they call radical federalism, take over a state. Vermont was the smallest one, move to Vermont. Author picks this up and writes an article based on it in Playboy magazine, of all places, saying, take over Vermont. Young white hippies move by the tens of thousands to Vermont. They sleep in the fields, they sleep in communes, they do whatever, and they change Vermont from one of the most conservative states in the Union to now is one of the most liberal states in America. They didn't do it because they had a six-figure job waiting. They did it because they believed in the possibility of change. These weren't the wealthy people who were doing the moving. These were the hippies who had nothing. What I'm saying is there is actually real economic possibilities for Black people in the South. Some of the places where Black middle class is doing best in America is in the South. Some of the wealthiest Black neighborhoods in Maryland around DC are in the South. I'm saying everybody who believes in this possibility should take their opportunity to pursue it, or at least deeply consider it. And not everybody's going to migrate. Not everybody migrated during the Great Migration. The majority of Black people stayed in the South. Not every white person migrated during the Dust Bowl. Not every white person migrated during the Gold Rush. Everybody doesn't migrate in any migrational movement. Just those who are most inclined. And those are the people who I'm appealing to.
All right. Also, in that whole thing, your own personal journey. I was looking at page 145, and you talked about going to college and the importance of attending Grambling State. Would you talk to a bit about your own personal experience? You wanted to be a witness to what you believe.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, the thing about my life is that I have always existed, well, for the most part, in majority Black spaces. I was born in Shreveport, which is majority Black. I grew up in Gibson, Louisiana, majority Black town. I went to Grambling State University, HB, a historically Black college in a majority Black town. When my first job out of college was in Detroit, Michigan, a majority Black city. When I moved to New York, I didn't move to a majority Black city, but I moved to a majority Black neighborhood, which is Prospect Heights, which is Shirley Chisholm's old district. And now I've moved back to Atlanta, which is a majority Black city. I understand what that feels like to live in an environment where you are honored and nurtured, where people believe in you, and it doesn't feel like the power structure is hunting you or that it hates you. And I want that feeling for everybody.
But you also talked about the importance of altruism, the part of giving back.
Yes.
Many of the scholars on the left who are Black, who talk about these issues, are doing some from a different perch. They're not talking about it from Grambling or Cheney State, where I went. And I thank God for that experience, because I had some professors who took this school dropout who hadn't read a book until I was 20 years old, and sewed into me the importance of learning. He could have been teaching at Harvard, but he was teaching at Cheney.
Yes.
And it's what you talk about when you talk about, it's a beautiful passage about deciding to attend Grambling State, and the importance of to define yourself not by the celebrity that you can derive from your sacrifice, but the altruism that it gives you a chance to express.
Yes.
I found that most eloquent when you were talking about what it means to you personally. And I think few people spend as much time witnessing of their beliefs rather than just writing about them. And that's also what I found intriguing about the book.
Thank you.
What is your first step after its publication? Who do you think would gravitate to this? What are your hopes that this will accomplish?
My hope is that it sparks conversation around this as a real thing. You know, some of the early reviews said, "Oh, it's a great thought experiment," and I kept thinking, "No, it's not. I'm serious." And I want people to genuinely think about it, because I don't know when else it would be possible. Number one, in a couple of decades, you'll see more balkanization in America. Several of the southwestern states will be not majority Hispanic. They will be able to send congressional delegations to Congress, and they should if they want. That's their prerogative. There will be more Asian people in America than Black people. The Washington, Oregon, down into the Rockies will remain, and the Plain States will remain majority white. But on the East Coast, you'll have some mix of maybe majority minorities, but most likely white plurality. No state in the union is expected to be majority Black by that point. Now, and Hawaii obviously has always been majority Asian, Pacific Islander, South Pacific Islander, and will continue to be. Do we want part of this state power pie or not? If we don't, that's fine. I say, but what I want to put before people is either you're going to have power or you're not, and it's going to require a decision on your part, and may require some sacrifice on your part. Revolutionary acts are never simple. They're never not fraught. They're never without the possibility of disaster even. But you're either going to take a revolutionary step or you're not. But I don't want you to not do it, not knowing that it was a possibility, that there was a path, and you just didn't take it.
Dr. King said that the highest form of maturity is the ability to be self-critical. And in your book, you talk about the need for sort of a change in leadership, particularly the Congressional Black Caucus. Many of them are my age, and there is a need to regenerate, to refurbish. I happen to agree with you. How do you think that should occur?
I mean, I just make the point that if you look at the white membership of Congress and the Black caucus delegation, the Black caucus is appreciably older than the white members of Congress. And I do believe that there is so much young energy that some of that should become part of our leadership delegations. We should have more of an infusion of the young thought and young energy and young legs to get involved in that, and not have this kind of elder worship mentality around Black leadership, that the people who came of age in the 60s and 70s are the people who should lead us into the 2000s and the 2030s, 2020 and 2030s. That is not what I believe. I look at these pretty much every major city in the South now has a Black mayor. Not all of them, but close. Many of them are these young, dynamic people. We just had this young man in Baltimore. Young, dynamic, energetic, new thoughts. We need that not just on the municipal level. We need that on the state level. We need that in the federal government.
There was when I was some years ago, had a discussion with Maynard Jackson and some of the Black mayors, and I asked some of these same questions. And I asked them, for instance, Maynard, you're from Atlanta, you can appreciate this.
Well, I just moved to Atlanta. I'm not from Atlanta.
I mean, that you know Atlanta.
Yes.
When the time decision was made about the redevelopment of the downtown area, I asked Maynard, why were Peachtree Street selected and not Auburn Avenue? Auburn Avenue, of course, is where the traditional Black Wall Street was.
Mm-hmm.
And Peachtree Street is downtown where white businesses are. And I asked Maynard at that time, why did you select the redevelopment of Peachtree Street as opposed to Auburn Avenue?
What was his answer? Now I'm intrigued.
He just stumbled. And he didn't want to say why.
What do you think the reason was?
Because he and his friends, the Black elite that you're talking about, benefited economically from that choice. And that's why it happened city after city. And that's why I agree with your point that leadership chose personal celebrity, personal gain at the expense of their own people. And that's the dilemma that we face. And you make that point in your personal testimony that we need leadership that chooses what's best for the majority of people, or what's best for the least of these.
Yes, yes.
And not what's best for my career.
Yes.
And so that's what I found most intriguing about your book, the emphasis on character as opposed to political power.
Thank you.
And I just want to know if I got that right.
Yeah, yes.
And that's good. But in the minutes that are left,
yes.
What are some of the things you want people to remember most about your book? If you could just outline, what is it that you want us to at least take to your book when we're reading it?
Yes, I want people to remember that racism in America is everywhere, and that this idea that it's all in the South and less in the North, and all, that's a lot of that's myth making. And so when you understand that, you can then make decisions that are not dependent on that mythology. Mm-hmm. Number two, that there is a thriving Black middle class in the South. And in addition to that, there's tremendous amount of Black leadership, particularly on the municipal level in the South. So you can have a different sort of sensibility around how your government, your local government is run and who they're responsive to. The third thing that's important to me is that I believe that there are, generally speaking, two Black Americas. This is not, of course, including are brothers from new immigrants from Africa or the Caribbean. But generally speaking, there are the sons and daughters of the Great Migration and the sons and daughters of the people who stayed in the South. And that there are cultural differences that have developed that are different for those people. And that I believe that those cultures, that in reunion of those cultures lies an amazing possibility for Black culture overall, that brings some of that artistic, intellectual dynamism, organizing, protesting in the street, rage-filled, whatever, bring that back and join it to this idea of legacy and rootedness and family and structure that the South has in its Black community. Somewhere between those two things, or within the amalgamation of those two things, is magic.
In other words, what I hear you saying is that people are motivated to change and improve when they are inspired by victories that are possible.
Yes.
And not always reminding them of injuries to be avoided.
Okay.
And in your book, you clearly do lay out some benchmarks, some things for us to strive for. Again, I may disagree on some of the details, but I'm inspired with the idea that there is a big idea.
Okay.
Because it then challenges, if people disagree with you, they ought to disagree with you by offering their solution.
Yes.
And not just offering a counter argument.
Yes.
So that's my advice as an elder to a young person.
All right.
Don't let people get away.
I didn't think I was so young, though, but okay, I'll take it.
Oh, yeah, you are. You are. Trust me on that one. And it's refreshing, though, to read your book and to meet you and to be inspired by a person in your generation who really is seeking remedies, and you see value in our past, and you see a future filled with promise.
Thank you so much.
But in our destiny is in our own hands. As Dr. King said, that the enemy, the victimizer may have knocked you down, but the victim has to get up. And I see what you have written here, a policy and a solution for getting up. I applaud you.
Thank you.
And I recommend everybody go out and buy this book.
Thank you so much.
And it's just good spending the time with you.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards podcast. Subscribe, rate, and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Send us an email at podcasts@c-span.org.